Form and meaning. A note on the phenomenology of language T6 Yap 9 Vos TOV Ju 6// Pounder UVOT 4. L. Plotinus. Phenomenology has criticized metaphysics as it is in fact only in order to restore it. It has informed metaphysics about its actual state of affairs in order to reawaken it to the essence of its task, to its original and authentic purpose. This is recalled in the latter pages of the Cartesian Meditations. Against adventurous speculation, against naive and degenerate metaphysics, we must return to the critical project of first philosophy / if certain metaphysical systems awaken suspicion, even if the whole of existing metaphysics is suspended by phenomenology, this does not exclude metaphysics in general. To follow this movement of critical purification in phenomenology, the concept of form could be used as a guiding thread. If the word form translates several Greek terms in a highly equivocal way, we can be sure nonetheless that all these terms themselves refer back to founding metaphysical concepts. By reinscribing the Greek terms, eidos, morphe, etc., into the language of phenomenology, by playing upon the differences between the Greek, Latin, and German, Husserl clearly wanted to disengage the original concepts from the later and supervenient metaphysical interpretations, which, he declared, charged the word with an invisible sedimentation. One but Husserl labors always to restore a primordial sense to these terms, a sense which began to be perverted at the time of its inscription into the tradition. Thus Husserl often goes against the first thinkers, against Plato and Aristotle. Whether it is a question of determining the eidos against Platonism, the form, in the problem of formal logic and ontology, or morphe, in the problem of transcendental constitution and in its relations with Hyl, against Aristotle, the force, vigilance, and efficacy of the critique remains intrametaphysical in its motives. How could it be otherwise? As soon as we use the concept of form, even to criticize another concept of form, we must appeal to the evidence of a certain source of sense. And the medium of this evidence can only be the language of metaphysics. For that language we know what form means, how the possibility of its variations is ordered, what its limits are, and the field of all conceivable disputes concerning it. The system of oppositions in which something like form can be considered, the formality of form, is a finite system. Furthermore, it is not enough to say that form has a sense for us, a center of evidence, or that its essence is given to us as such. Indeed, this concept is, and always has been, indissociable from the concepts of appearance, sense, evidence, or essence. Only a form is evident, only a form has or is an essence, only a form presents itself as such. This is a point of certainty that no interpretation of the Platonic or Aristotelian conceptual system can dislodge. All the concepts by which eidos or morphe could be translated and determined refer back to the theme of presence in general. Form is presence itself. Formality is what is presented, visible, and conceivable of the thing in general. That metaphysical thought, and consequently phenomenology, is the thought of being as form, that in it thought is conceived as a thought of form and the formality of form, is nothing less than necessary. The fact that Husserl determines the living present, lebendige Gegenwart, as the ultimate, universal, and absolute form of transcendental experience in general is a final indication of this. Although the privilege of the Ola is not, in phenomenology, as simple as has sometimes been claimed, although the classical theories are profoundly re-examined therein, the metaphysical domination of the concept of form cannot fail to effectuate a certain subjection to the look. This subjection would always be a subjection of sense to seeing, of sense to the sense of sight, since sense in general is in fact the concept of every phenomenological field. The implications of such a putting on view could be unfolded in many directions and by proceeding from what would appear to be the most diverse places within the text and problems of phenomenology. It could be shown, for example, how this putting on view and this concept of form permit a movement between the project of formal ontology, the description of time or of intersubjectivity, the latent theory of the work of art, etc. But if sense is not speech, the relationship with regard to this putting on view no doubt deserves some particular attention. Thus we have here chosen to narrow our perspective and address ourselves particularly to a text that concerns the status of language in ideas I. Among the determination of this status, the privilege of the formal, and the predominance of the theoretical there is a certain systematic interchange. And yet the coherence of this system seems to be worked over by something outside that relation to the outside which is the relation to form. It is out of this circularity and uneasiness that we want only to raise some preliminary indications, with the conviction that not only does ideas I not contradict the logical investigations on this point but, on the contrary, continually makes it explicit and that no text posterior to ideas I has ever expressly reconsidered its analyses. Meaning in the text for more than 2/3 of the book, transcendental experience is presented as though it were silent, as though it were inhabited by no language whatever, or rather, as though it were deserted by expression as such, for, since the investigations, Husserl had in fact determined the essence or telos of language as expression, Ausdruck. The transcendental description of the fundamental structures of all experience is followed up until the end of the next to last section without the problem of language even being touched upon. The cultural world and the world of science are indeed evoked, but even though in fact the predicates of culture and science are inconceivable outside a world of language, Husserl takes himself to be justified, for methodological reasons, in not considering the stratum of expression, in provisionally putting it between brackets. Husserl can assume he is justified in so doing only by supposing that expression constitutes an original and strictly delimited stratum, strict, of experience. What the investigations had proposed an emphatic demonstration of, and what remains presupposed in ideas I, is that acts of expression are original and irreducible in their nature. Thus at a certain moment of the descriptive itinerary, we can come to consider linguistic expression as a circumscribed problem. And we already know from the moment we approach it that the stratum of logos will be included in the most general structure of experience, whose poles or correlations were just described, the parallel opposition of the noesis and the noema. Thus it is already assumed that, however original its nature may be, the stratum of logos has to be organized according to the noetic-noematic parallelism. The problem of meaning, BD 10.2 is broached in Ideas I in 124, entitled the noetic-noematic stratum of the logos. Meaning and meaning something, BD 10 und BD 2, the metaphor of the stratum, strict, has two implications. On the one hand, meaning is founded on something other than itself, and this dependence will be continually confirmed by Husserl's analysis. On the other hand, it constitutes a layer whose unity can be strictly delimited. But if the metaphor of the stratum is approved throughout the section, in the last few lines it will nonetheless be held suspect. This suspicion is not purely rhetorical, it translates a profound uneasiness over the descriptive fidelity of speech. If the metaphor of the stratum does not answer to the structure to be described, how could it have been used so long? For we should not hold too hard by the metaphor of stratification. Strichtung, expression is not of the nature of an overlaid varnish, Tybergelagerte lack, or covering garment. It is a mental formation, geistige Formung, which exercises new intentional influences, function, on the intentional substratum, and der intentionalen Unterschicht, and experiences from the latter correlative intentional influences, P 349.8. This distrust of a metaphor manifests itself at the moment when a new complication of the analysis becomes necessary. We would like only to note here that, before encountering thematic difficulties, the effort to isolate the logical stratum of expression encounters difficulties in its enunciation. The discourse on the logic of speech becomes caught up in the play of metaphors. That of the stratum, as we shall see, is far from being the only one. From the start of the analysis, the concern to bring out what it is that assures the properly logical function of speech is manifest. We find that the essence or telos of language is determined as logical and that, as in the investigations, the theory of speech reduces the considerable mass of what is not purely logical in language to extrinsic value. One metaphor already betrays the difficulty of this first reduction, a difficulty which, having been only deferred and not resolved at the end of the paragraph, will require new explanations and new distinctions. Acts of expression, act strata in the specific logical sense, are interwoven, verwoben sic, with all the acts hitherto considered, and in their case no less than in the others the parallelism of noesis and noema must be clearly brought out. The prevalent and unavoidable ambiguity of our ways of speaking, which is caused by this parallelism and is everywhere operative where the concomitant circumstances are mentioned, operates also of course when we talk of expression and meaning. 124, et. p. 345. The interweaving, verwebung, of language, of what is purely linguistic in language with the other threads of experience, constitutes one fabric. The term verwebung refers to this metaphorical zone. The strata are woven, their intermixing is such that the warp cannot be distinguished from the woof. If the stratum of logos were simply founded, one could set it aside so as to let the underlying substratum of non-expressive acts and contents appear beneath it. But since this superstructure reacts in an essential and decisive way upon the unchecked substratum, one is obliged, from the start of the description, to associate the geological metaphor with a properly textual metaphor, for fabric or textile means text. Verweben here means techeria. The discursive refers to the non-discursive. The linguistic stratum is intermixed with the prelinguistic stratum according to the controlled system of a sort of text. We already know, and Husserl does recognize it, that, at least in fact, the secondary threads are going to act on the primary threads, with what is woven, out it, in such a way, it is precisely the operation of beginning, or diri, which can no longer be recaptured. In the spinning out of language the discursive woof is rendered unrecognizable as a woof and takes the place of a warp. It takes the place of something that has not really preceded it. This texture is all the more inextricable in that it is wholly signifying. The non-expressive threads are not without signification. In the investigations Husserl has showed that their signification is simply of an indicative nature. In the section we are now concerned with, he recognizes that the terms Bedeutung and Bedeutung can well exceed the expressive field. We restrict our glance exclusively to the meaning content, Bedeutung, and the act of meaning, Bedeuten. Originally these words relate only to the sphere of speech, sprachliche Sphere, that of expression, des Ausdruckens. But it is almost inevitable, and at the same time an important step for knowledge, to extend the meaning of these words, and to modify them suitably so that they may be applied in a certain way to the whole noetico-noematic sphere, to all acts, therefore, whether these are interwoven, verflochten, with expressive acts or not. 124, et. p. 346, modified. Before this inextricable texture, this interweaving, verflichtung, for that seems to defy analysis, the phenomenologist does not become discouraged. His patience and attention to detail should, at least theoretically, disentangle the confusion. This is what follows from phenomenology's principle of principles. If the description does not bring out a ground that would absolutely and plainly found signification in general, if an intuitive and perceptual ground, a base of silence, does not found speech in the primordially given presence of the thing itself, if, in short, the texture of the text is irreducible, then, not only will the phenomenological description have failed, but the descriptive principle itself will have to be re-examined. What is at stake in this disentanglement is thus the phenomenological motif itself. Mirrored writing. Husserl begins by delimiting the problem, simplifying or purifying its given data. He proceeds to a double exclusion or, if one likes, a double reduction, complying with a necessity he had established in the investigations and which will never again be re-examined. On the one hand, the sensible aspect of language, its sensible and non-material aspect, what could be called the animated proper body, Leib, of language is put out of play. Since, for Husserl, expression supposes a meaning intention, Bedeutung's intention, its essential condition therefore is the pure act of the animating intention and not the body to which, in a mysterious way, it is united and gives life. Husserl accords himself the right to dissociate this enigmatic unity of the informing intention and the informed matter in its very principle. This is why, on the other hand, he defers, forever, it seems, the problem of the unity of the two aspects, the problem of the union of soul and body. Let us start from the familiar distinction between the sensory, the so to speak bodily aspect, Leib-like incit, of expression, and its non-sensory mental aspect. There is no need for us to enter more closely into the discussion of the first aspect, nor upon the way of uniting the two aspects, though we clearly have title headings here indicated for phenomenological problems that are not unimportant. 124, et. p. 346. After Husserl takes this double precaution, the contours of the problem appear more clearly. What distinctive traits separate the essentially expressive stratum from the pre-expressive stratum, and how can the effects of one on the other be subjected to an eidetic analysis? This question will receive its full formulation only after a certain progress made in the analysis. How to interpret the expressing of what is expressed, how expressed experiences stand in relation to those that are not expressed, and what changes the latter undergo when expression supervenes. One is then led to the question of their intentionality, of their immanent meaning, of their content, metry, and quality, i.e., the act character of the thesis, of the distinction of this meaning and these phases of the essence which lie in the pre-expressive from the meaning of the expressing phenomenon itself and its own phases, and so forth. One gathers still in various ways from the writings of the day how little justice is apt to be done to the great problems here indicated in their full and deep-lying significance. 124, et. p. 348. This problem had, of course, already been posed, especially at the beginning of the sixth logical investigation, but the path which leads up to it is different here, not only for very general reasons, the access to an explicitly transcendental problem, the appeal to the notion of the noema, the acknowledged generality of the noetic-noematic structure, but in particular by virtue of the distinction that has come to be added, in the interim, between the concepts of Sinn and Bedeutung. Not that Husserl now accepts the distinction proposed by Frege, which he had contested in the investigations, he simply finds it convenient to reserve the Bedeutung to mean meaning, terms for the order of expressive meaning, for speech in the strict sense, and to extend the concept of sense, Sinn, to the totality of the noematic side of experience, whether or not it is expressive. 7 As soon as the extension of sense exceeds that of meaning, speech will always have to draw its sense. It will only be able somehow to repeat or reproduce a sense content, which does not wait for speech in order to be what it is. 8 If it is as we have described it, speech can only be the outward transfer of a sense that is constituted without it and before it. This is one of the reasons why the essence of logical meaning is determined as expression, Ausdruck. Speech is in essence expressive because it consists in carrying outside, in exteriorizing, a content of interior thought. It cannot operate without this sic or cern, expressing oneself, that was spoken of in the first investigation, 7. Thus we are already in possession of the first distinctive trait of the expressive stratum. If, physically or not, it only proffers a constituted sense, it is essentially reproductive, that is, unproductive. The first stage of Husserl's analysis proceeds toward this definition, the stratum of expression, and this constitutes its peculiarity, apart from the fact that it lends expression to all other intentionalities, is not productive. Or if one prefers, its productivity, its wematic service, exhausts itself in expressing, and in the form of the conceptual which first comes with the expressing, 124, et. pp. 348-49. This unproductiveness of the logos becomes, so to speak, incorporated, prend cor, in Husserl's description. And it becomes seduced by two metaphors which cannot escape our attention. The first seems to have passed unperceived by Husserl. It shifts between a kind of writing and a mirror, or, rather, it tells of mirrored writing. Let us follow its constitution. To explain the difference between sense and meaning, Husserl resorts to a perceptual example, the silent perception of this white. In a way the statement this is white is quite independent of perceptual experience. It is intelligible even for someone who does not have this perception. This had been forcefully demonstrated in the investigations. This independence of the expressive function implies the independence of the perceptual sense. We can make this sense explicit. The process makes no call whatsoever on expression, neither on expression in the sense of verbal sound nor on the like as verbal meaning, and here the latter can also be present independently of the verbal sound, as in the case when this sound is forgotten. 124, et. p. 347. The passage to the enunciation consequently adds nothing to the sense. In any event, it adds no sense content to it. And yet, despite this sterility, or rather because of it, the appearance of expression is something quite new. It is somehow quite new, because it only restates the noematic sense. Since it neither adds nor deforms anything, expression can always in principle repeat the sense by bringing it to conceptual form, if we have thought. Or stated this is white, a new stratum is there with the rest, and unites with the ment as such in its pure perceptive form. On these lines everything remembered or fancied can, as such, have its meaning made more explicit and expressible, explicierbar und ausdrückbar. Whatever is meant, gemint, as such every meaning, Meinung, in the noematic sense, and indeed as noematic nucleus, of any act whatsoever can be expressed conceptually. Dirk B. Dutungen, 124, et. p. 347. Husserl then declares, as a universal rule, that logical meaning is an act of expression, logist Bedutung ist ein Ausdruck. Everything therefore is in principle capable of being said, everything must be able to be brought to the conceptual generality that properly constitutes the logicality of logos. And this must be so, not despite but thanks to the originality of the medium of logical expression, which consists in not introducing anything new, in effacing itself like an unproductive transparency before the passage of sense. But this transparency must have some consistency, not only in order to express, but first of all to be impressed with, what it will then present to be read. From the noetic standpoint the rubric expressing should indicate a special act stratum to which all other acts must adjust themselves in their own way, and with which they must blend remarkably in such wise that every noematic act sense, and consequently the relation to objectivity which lies in it, impresses itself, sic ausprdgt. Strikes or stamps itself, conceptually, begrifflich, in the noematic phase of the expressing, 124, et. p. 347, modified. Thus the pre-expressive noema, the prelinguistic sense, must be impressed on the expressive noema, it must acquire its conceptual determination in the meaning content. To be limited to bearing outwardly an already constituted sense, at the same time bringing it to conceptual generality without altering it, expressing what has already been thought, we should almost say written, and faithfully reduplicating it. Expression must let itself be impressed by sense at the same time that it impresses the sense. The sense must be inscribed in the meaning. The expressive noema must present itself, and here is the new image of its unproductiveness, as a blank page or a clean slate, at least as a palimpsest restored to its pure receptivity. As soon as the inscription of sense upon the expressive noema makes it readable, the logical order of conceptuality as such will be constituted. The expressive noema then will present itself begrifflich, in a discernible, workable, conceivable, and conceptual way. The conceptual order is inaugurated by expression, but this inauguration reduplicates a pre-existing conceptuality, since it must have been from the start impressed upon the blank page of meaning. Production and revelation are unified in the impression-expression proper to speech. And since what Husserl is considering here is not the verbal order, with all its interwoven, physical and intentional, complexity, but the still silent meaning intention, i.e., the moment meaning, which is more than sense, has appeared but has not yet been effectively and physically offered, we must conclude that sense in general, the noematic sense of every experience, is something which, by its very nature, must be already able to be impressed on a meaning, to leave or receive its formal determination in a meaning. Sense would therefore already be a kind of blank and mute writing which is reduplicated in meaning. The stratum of meaning then would have only the kind of originality of the tabula rasa. This metaphor will bring on serious problems, as we can already foresee. If, in particular, there is an original history and permanence proper to concepts, such as they are already inscribed in the meaning alone, and even with the supposition that the meaning can be separated from the history of a language and of its signifiers, they are always older than the sense, and constitute a text also. Even if we could, in principle, suppose some virginal text that had received, in mo tempore, the first production of sense, it is in fact necessary that the systematic order of meaning somehow impose its own sense on that sense, dictate its own form to it, and oblige it to be imprinted according to syntactic or other rules. And this in fact is not one empirical necessity among others. We cannot put it in brackets in order to ask questions that are transcendental in principle, since the status of meaning cannot be fixed without, at the same time, determining the status of sense. The putting of this fact in brackets is a decision about the status of sense in general in its relation to speech. It does not depend on phenomenology, rather it opens up phenomenology in a non-critical movement. And although, in what followed, Husserl never again questioned this de jure anteriority of sense in relation to meaning, of Shin in relation to B. 10, why it is difficult to see how it is reconcilable with the subsequent thematic, for example, with that of the origin of geometry. This thematic is just what we are following at this moment, at the same time that we are following the theme of a sedimented history of meaning. And even if we considered only the ecological history, how could we ever conceive of the perpetual restoration of meaning in its virginal state? Husserl's attention is not held by the scriptural analogy, it is drawn away by another metaphor. The medium that receives the imprint will be neutral. After having discussed the conceptual Ausprägung, impression, Husserl describes its medium as neutral, without a color of its own, without any determinate opacity, without refractive power. But this neutral character of the medium is less that of transparency than of a mirror reflection. A peculiar intentional instrument lies before us which essentially possesses the outstanding characteristic of reflecting back as from a mirror. Why das Spiegel? Every other intentionality according to its form and content, of copying, abzubilden, it whilst coloring it in its own way, and thereby of working into, einzubilden, it its own form of conceptuality. 124, et. pp 347-48. There is a double effect of the medium, a double relation between logos and sense. On the one hand, it is a pure and simple reflection, a reflection which respects what it receives and returns, depicts the sense as such in its original colors and represents it in person. This is language as a Bildung, copy, portrait, figuration, representation. But, on the other hand, this reproduction imposes the blank imprint of the concept. It forms the sense in the meaning, it produces a specific non-production, which, without changing anything in the sense, pictures something in it. The concept is produced without adding anything to the sense. We could speak here, in a certain sense, of conceptual fiction and a kind of imagination that would take up the intuition of sense into conceptual generality. This would be language as Einbildung. The two terms do not enter into Husserl's description fortuitously. What is peculiar to the unproductive production of the logical would be just this strange concurrence of a Bildung and Einbildung. Is this conception self-contradictory? Husserl in any event betrays a certain uneasiness. And we shall have to think over the fact that he attributes the indecisiveness of his description to the incidentally metaphorical character of language, which he precisely calls the Bildlichkeit of speech. It is because speech must occasionally use images, figures, and analogies, linguistic debris, so to speak, that logos must be described both as the unproductivity of a Bildung and as the productivity of Einbildung. If we were to eliminate the Bildlichkeit in descriptive speech, we would, by the same token, eliminate the apparent contradiction between a Bildung and Einbildung. But Husserl does not ask how this nucleic Bilden, to construct, to form, to fashion, operates in its relations with logos. The passage we just quoted continues, yet these figures of speech which here thrust themselves upon us, those of mirroring and copying, must be adopted with caution, as the imaginativeness, Bildlichkeit, metaphorical representation, depiction, pictorial representation, which colors their application might easily lead one astray, irrefieren. Thus the metaphor, in every sense of this term, is seductive. Phenomenological speech should resist this seduction. The limiting power of form. If Husserl questions all the predicates related to the medium of logos, he never criticizes the concept of medium itself. The expressive stratum is a medium, that is, both an element and a means, an ether that accepts the sense, and a means of giving it conceptual form. The term medium often appears on the following pages. It enters into the formulation of the problem of the history of concepts, whose difficulties we mentioned earlier in relation with the subsequent themes of the origin of geometry. Even at this point Husserl formulates the difficulty 9 that will constitute the central theme of that work. Problems of exceptional difficulty beset the phenomena which find their place under the headings to mean, be due 10, and meaning, be due 2. Since every science, viewed from the side of its theoretical content, of all that constitutes its doctrine, layer, theorem, proof, theory, is objectified in a specific logical ** medium, the medium of expression, it follows that for philosophers and psychologists who are guided by general logical interests the problems of expression and meaning, be due to, lie nearest of all, and are also the first, generally speaking, which, so soon as one seeks seriously to reach their foundations, compel towards phenomenological inquiry into the essential nature of things. 124, et. p. 348. Theory, therefore, can neither dispense with objectification in the medium nor tolerate the least deformation in the submission to it. While there is no scientific sense, shin, without meaning, be due 10, it belongs to the essence of science to demand a strict univocity, an absolute transparency of speech. Science would thus require that what it needs, speech as pure meaning, serve for nothing but to guard and preserve the sense that science has conferred upon it. Nowhere can speech be both more productive and more unproductive than as an element of theory. If this unproductive productivity is the telos of expression, then it is clearly confirmed that logico-scientific speech has been continually functioning here as a model for all possible speech. The whole analysis will henceforth have to shift between two concepts, two values. On the one hand, ideal speech will have to achieve an overlapping or coincidence, Deckung, of the non-expressive stratum of sense with the expressive stratum of meaning. But for reasons we have already recognized, this overlapping must never be a confusion. And the work of clarification, distinction, and articulation, etc., must bear upon these two strata as such. The difference between coincidence and confusion leads us back, then, to the very opening of our problem. But perhaps this formulation will allow us to progress. In the best of cases, in the perfect overlapping of the two strata, there would thus be a parallelism. The concept of the parallel would respect both the perfect correspondence and the non-confusion. And according to an analogy that must be examined, it would have to play as decisive a role here as in the case where Husserl explicitly brings it in to describe the relations between the purely psychic and transcendental. Only if the sense of the underlying substratum is completely reproduced by the meaning, if not by effective speech, can the parallelism of the two strata be a perfect overlapping. There is always a certain overlapping of the two strata, for without this the phenomenon of expression would not even occur. This overlapping, however, can be incomplete. We must further lay stress on the difference between complete, vollständigem, and incomplete, unvollständigem, expression. The unity of the expressing and the expressed in the phenomenon is indeed that of a certain overlapping, Deckung, but the upper layer need not extend its expressing function over the entire lower layer. Expression is complete when the stamp of conceptual meaning has been impressed, or spragged, upon all the synthetic forms and matter, materion, of the lower layer, incomplete when this is only partially effected, as when, in regard to a complex process, the arrival of the carriage, perhaps, bringing guests that have been long expected, we call out, the carriage. The guests. This difference of completeness will naturally cut across that of relative clearness and distinctness. 126, et. p. 352, modified. Up until this point we might have thought that the incompleteness of expression and the non-parallelism of the two strata figure only as facts or accidents, and that, even if such a fact occurs frequently, if it nearly always affects the entirety of our speech, it does not belong to the essence of expression. The example just cited by Husserl does in fact belong to the language of everyday life, and one can still suppose that the mission and power of scientific expression consists in mastering these ambiguities and restoring the completeness of the sense intended in expression. However, at the risk of compromising an axiom, the unproductive and reflective function of expression, Husserl also brings to light an essential incompleteness of expression, an inadequacy that no effort can ever surmount, precisely because it belongs to the conceptual form, to formality itself, without which expression would not be what it is. It seemed, above, that Husserl wanted to insist upon the reflective, reproductive, repetitive nature of expression, on its Abilden, but to neutralize its effects and its marks, its power of deformation or refraction, its Einbilden. He now insists, on the contrary, upon an essential shift of expression that would prevent it from ever bringing out the stratum of sense. Meaning, BDU10, will never be the duplicate of sense, shin, and this difference is nothing less than that of the concept. We must read the whole of this paragraph. An incompleteness of a totally different kind, ein total anderer Unverstandigkeit, from the one just discussed is that which belongs to the essential nature of the expression as such, namely, to its generality, Allgemeinheit. One would like expresses the wish in a general form, the form of command. The command might very well be the presumption, or the likely as such, and so forth. Every closer determination in the unity of the expression is itself again expressed in general form. It lies in the meaning of the generality which belongs to the essential nature of the expressing function that it would not ever be possible for all the specifications of the expressed to be reflected, sic reflectieren, in the expression. The stratum of the meaning function is not, and in principle is not, a sort of duplication, reduplication, of the lower stratum. 126, et. p. 352. Referring back to the whole problem of complete and incomplete expressions in the logical investigations, Husserl then evokes the functions of the underlying substratum, which in principle cannot be repeated in expression, the qualities of clarity, distinctness, attentional modifications, etc. This impoverishment is the condition for scientific formalization. There is univocity to the extent that the complete repetition of sense in the meaning is given up. We cannot even say, therefore, that de facto incompleteness, taken as form and meaning /123 in essential or accidental, is reduced by a teleology of scientific speech, or that it is included, as a provisional obstacle, within the horizon of an infinite task. The telos of scientific speech itself, and as such, involves an eschewing of completeness. Difference here is not a provisional deficiency of epistemd taken as speech, it is its own means, the positive condition of its activity and productivity. It is as much the limit of scientific power as the power of the scientific limit, it is the limiting power of its formality. The form is, its ellipsis. These remarks apparently concerned, above all, the relationship of the form of statements with their sense content, the order of meaning with the noematic order in general. But they now imply an essential decision concerning the relationship between statements themselves within the general system of expression. To be able to determine the relationship between expression and sense as we have, did we not already have to have taken a certain type of statement as absolutely privileged? Is there not an essential relationship between formal import and a certain sentence structure? By the same token, is there not an easy movement from a certain type of noema, or experience of sense, to the order of meaning, a movement that somehow makes the whole of this phenomenology of logos possible? With this question we retrace our first steps. What about the concept of form? How does it inscribe phenomenology within the closure of metaphysics? How does it determine the sense of being as presence, indeed, as the present? What secretly connects it with that delimitation of the sense of being that makes us think of it particularly in the verbal form of the present and, more narrowly still, in the third person present indicative? What does the complicity between form in general, eidos, morphe, and the is, esti, suggest for our thought? Let us bring these questions back into contact with Husserl's text at the point where the formal impoverishment comes to be recognized as an essential rule. Then the problem of the relationship between the different types of statements arises quite naturally. Is the statement in the form of the judgment, 124/other essays the form it is thus /one statement among others? Is not some particular excellence reserved for it in the stratum of expressiveness? We must be clear about all these points if one of the oldest and hardest problems of the sphere of meaning, Bedeutungssphere, is to be solved, a problem which hitherto, precisely because it lacked the requisite phenomenological insight, has remained without solution, the problem, namely, as to how statement as the expression of judgment is related to the expressions of other acts, 127, et. p. 353. The answer to such a question had been prepared, and its necessity announced, at a step in the analysis which was not yet concerned with the stratum of expression. There it was a question of bringing forth the evidence, in practical or effective experience, in the acts of aesthetic or moral evaluation, etc., for a doxic core which, still allowing us to think of values as states of being, the wished for as the being wished for, the agreeable as the being agreeable, etc., 114, constitutes, so to speak, the logicality of the pre-expressive stratum. It is because this silent stratum always carries with it a relation to form, or always has the power to restore such a relation. It is because it can always convert its affective or axiological experience, its relation to what is not a being present, into an experience that has the form being present, the beautiful as being beautiful, the desired as being desired, the dreaded future as the being dreaded future, the inaccessible as being inaccessible, and, as the limiting case, the absent as being absent, that it gives itself unreservedly to logical speech, speech controlled by the predicative form, that is, by the present indicative of the verb to be 10 for Husserl. Not only will this conversion not diminish the originality of practical, affective, axiological experiences and speech, but it will assure them the possibility of an unlimited formalization. 11 Having brought out that every act, as also every act correlate, harbors explicitly or implicitly a logical factor. 117, et. p. 332, Husserl has only to draw forth the consequences with regard to the expressive reworking of these acts and thus to confirm rather than discover the privilege of the is or predicative statement. The moment he repeats the question for the order of meaning, the answer, really, is already required. We should be neither surprised nor deceived by this. We find, like a rule of speech or textual rule, that the question can be inscribed only in the form dictated by the answer which awaits it, that is, which did not wait for it. It need only be asked how the answer has prescribed the form of the question, not according to the necessary, conscious, and calculated anticipation of someone who is conducting a systematic expose 6 but somehow unawares. Thus we can ask to what extent the reference to the expressive stratum, even before it has become thematic, has secretly guided the analyses of the pre-expressive stratum and has allowed us to discover in it a core of logical sense under the universal and allegedly silent form of being present. And we can ask whether, between being as being present in the form of meaning, Bdu10, and being as being present in what is called the pre-expressive form of sense, shin, some irreducible complicity has not functioned throughout this whole problem, fusing the two strata, thereby also enabling the one to relate to the other, articulating them. Is not this the locus of decision for all the problems we have pointed out thus far? 13 With this question, does not the very idea of an expressive language become problematic, as well as the possibility of a distinction between the stratum of sense and the stratum of meaning? Most important of all, can the relationships between the two strata be conceived with the category of expression? To say that the description of the infrastructure, of sense, has been secretly guided by the superstructural possibility of meaning is not to contest, against Husserl, the duality of the strata and the unity of a certain passage that relates them. Nor is it to wish to reduce one stratum to the other, or to judge the complete recapture of sense into meaning to be impossible. Nor is it to reconstruct experience, of sense, as a language, especially if we understand this to be speech, a verbal fabric, or to produce a critique of language based on the ineffable richness of sense. It is simply to ask a question about another relationship between what is, problematically, called sense and meaning. That is, it is to question the unity of sense and word in the vice, which the Ure could have assured the incorporation of all language into theoretical predication only by already having teleologically destined all sense to meaning. And it is also to question the relationship between the is and formality in general. It is through the evidence of the present is, in evidence itself, that the whole of transcendental phenomenology is put forth in its supreme ambition, aiming to achieve both the constitution of an absolutely formal logic and ontology and the transcendental description of self-presence or primordial consciousness. It might then be thought that the sense of being has been limited by the imposition of form, which in its most overt function, and ever since the origin of philosophy, would, with the authority of the is, have assigned to the sense of being the closure of presence, the form of presence, presence in form, or form presence. 14 It might, on the contrary, be thought that formality, or formalization, is limited by the sense of being which in fact, throughout its whole history, has never been separated from its determination as presence, under the fine control of the is, and, therefore, that thought, controlled by the concept of form, has the power to extend itself beyond the thought devoted to being. But perhaps what Husserl's enterprise illustrates is that these two limits are the same. Phenomenology has been able to push the formalist demand to its extreme limit and to criticize all the preceding formalisms only on the basis of conceiving being as self-presence, only on the basis of a transcendental experience of pure consciousness. There is, then, probably no choice to be made between two lines of thought. Our task is rather to reflect on the circularity which makes the one pass into the other indefinitely. And, by strictly repeating this circle in its own historical possibility, we allow the production of some elliptical change of sight, within the difference involved in repetition. This displacement is no doubt deficient, but with a deficiency that is not yet, or is already no longer, absence, negativity, non-being, lack, silence. Neither matter nor form, it is nothing that any philosophem, that is, any dialectic, however determinate, can capture. It is an ellipsis of both meaning and form, it is neither plenary speech nor perfectly circular. More and less, neither more nor less, it is perhaps an entirely different question.